The afternoon light spilled lazily through the curtains, painting golden stripes across the old living room carpet. I had just come home from work, hoping for a quiet evening, when I heard the clinking of teacups and the low murmur of voices from the dining room. My parents were sitting at the table, a stack of papers spread between them. Their tone businesslike and focused. At first, I thought they were discussing bills or maybe another one of Dad's half-finished renovation projects. But then I heard my mother's voice, calm, practical, almost cheerful, say the words that froze me in place. "So the piano will go to the buyer on Saturday." My stomach dropped. "The piano?" I repeated, stepping into the room before I could stop myself. They both looked up, surprised. My mother smiled a little too brightly. "Oh, hi, sweetheart. Yes, we finally decided it's time to sell Grandma's piano. It's just taken up space and we never use it." I glanced toward the living room, where the grand piano sat in its usual corner, its mahogany body polished but a little faded with time. A lace runner draped across the top, a vase of dried roses still resting there. It looked like part of the house itself, something permanent, something sacred. "You're selling it?" I asked, as if repeating the question might make it less real. Dad sighed, rubbing his temple. "It's been sitting there for years, kiddo. Nobody plays it anymore? It's just collecting dust." That wasn't true, not completely. I still played sometimes, late at night when the house was asleep. It wasn't much, just small pieces Grandma had taught me when I was little, soft lullabies and half-forgotten songs. But I couldn't bring myself to say that now. Someone offered a good price. Mom continued, flipping through the papers. "We could finally fix the leaky roof and maybe redo the kitchen floors. Your father found a buyer who appreciates vintage instruments. It's not going to waste." I wanted to argue, to shout that they couldn't just sell it, that it wasn't some old cabinet or unused chair. But as I looked at their faces, I saw how practical the decision seemed to them. To them, the piano was just an object, a large, expensive, inconvenient piece of history that no longer served a purpose. To me, it was everything. I remembered sitting beside Grandma when I was 6, my legs too short to reach the pedals. Her soft voice whispering, "Gently, sweetheart. Let the music breathe." She'd guide my hands across the keys, her rings catching the light, her perfume lavender and something sweet filling the air. That piano had been our language, our secret place, but Grandma was gone now, and with her absence the piano had fallen silent. I suppose that silence made it easier for them to see it as useless. "We don't have space to keep sentimental things forever," Dad said gently. "It's time to move on." Move on. The phrase stung. Move on from what, our memories? Her laughter? The only tangible piece of her that still lived in this house? I looked back toward the living room again. The piano sat in the dim light, its keys like a row of silent teeth, waiting for a touch. A thin layer of dust shimmered on the lid. It did look lonely, I realized, but not unloved. "When?" I finally asked. "Saturday morning," Mom said. "The buyer's coming with a truck." 3 days. That's all I had? They went back to their discussion, talking about logistics, receipts, signatures. Their voices blurred together, fading into background noise as I stood frozen, my heart sinking with every word. I wanted to speak up, to tell them they were making a mistake. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, I walked into the living room, stood beside the piano, and ran my fingers over the smooth, cool surface. The same piano Grandma had played every Sunday morning. The same one she said held songs that remember us. Now it seemed it was about to forget. That night I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the piano being wheeled out of the house, its lid closed, its music silenced. The thought made my chest tighten. I tossed and turned until the faint sound of wind brushing against the curtains reminded me of something. Grandma once said, "Music never really leaves. It just waits to be played again." When I finally got up, the house was silent. The clock in the hallway ticked softly, each second echoing like a countdown. I padded barefoot into the living room, where the piano stood, half lit by the orange glow of the streetlight outside. Dust sparkled faintly across its surface like tiny stars. I sat down on the bench and lifted the lid. The faint creak of the hinge sounded almost like a sigh. My fingers hovered over the keys, unsure where to start. It had been months since I'd played anything more than a few scattered notes. The house felt different at night hollow listening. When I pressed a single key, the sound rang out, pure and clear, vibrating softly through the air. It was enough to pull me back to a time when Grandma's laughter filled this very room. I remembered the way she'd hum while baking lemon tarts in the kitchen, or how she'd call me over, patting the seat beside her. "Come, love. Let's play something for the flowers," she'd say. She believed music could make even the wilting roses stand tall. And somehow, when she played "It Did," the memories came flooding faster than I could hold them back. I saw myself, maybe 8 years old, sitting beside her as she guided my small hands across the keys. "Don't press too hard," she'd whisper. "The piano is alive, it breathes with you." I used to giggle at that, but she was right. Each note felt like a heartbeat, something living and warm. The room used to smell like her perfumed lavender and honey and the sound of her bracelets, clinking softly as she played. I'd mimic her hand movements when she wasn't looking, pretending I could play like her. When I finally managed to learn her favorite tune, she had cried, saying, "You've got my hands, sweetheart." Now, those same hands trembled on the keys. I tried playing the same melody, but it didn't sound the same. It felt empty without her voice humming along, without her gentle corrections. I stopped halfway through, pressing my palms flat on the keys. The low notes rumbling softly beneath them, a lump rose in my throat. I realized then that what hurt wasn't just losing the piano, it was losing what it held. Every song Grandma had played, every birthday sing-along, every quiet moment between us was trapped in those strings and keys. Selling it wasn't just selling furniture. It was selling a part of her. I looked around the room. The photos on the wall, Grandma in her garden, Grandma at my graduation, seemed to watch silently. I imagined what she'd say if she were here. She'd probably smile, tilt her head, and say something simple but sharp like, "Do you think music cares about money?" I let out a small laugh through my tears. Of course she'd say that when I finally stood up. I made a promise to myself. I wouldn't let the piano leave this house without trying to make them understand what it meant. They thought it was just an old instrument, but they didn't know how deeply it still breathed. I placed my hand one last time on the lid, feeling the faint vibration of the strings below. "I'll find a way," I whispered Dot, and in that quiet, it almost felt like the piano answered back softly, like a sigh. The next morning, sunlight spilled across the living room floor, touching the piano like a spotlight. For a second, it looked almost alive, like Grandma's spirit was sitting right there, waiting for me to play. But the illusion broke when I heard the sound of my father's drill in the hallway and my mother's voice calling out numbers from the kitchen. The house was awake, bustling, practical again. Dot at breakfast. I tried to bring it up. "Are you sure about selling the piano?" I asked, stirring my tea, though I wasn't drinking it. Mom didn't even look up from her phone. "We've already signed the agreement, honey. The man's transferring the deposit this evening." Dad nodded, taking a bite of toast. "It's better this way. You know how much maintenance those things need? Tuning, repairs, it's not worth it." "But it's Grandma's," I said quietly. Dad sighed. "I know, but she'd understand. She wouldn't want us to hold on to things we don't need." I bit back the urge to argue. She wouldn't want us to hold on to things. That wasn't true. Grandma held on to everything: letters, ribbons, recipes, memories. She used to say, "Things don't matter until they carry love." That piano carried more love than anything else in this house, but my parents were speaking in the language of adulthood, of numbers. Practicality, space. A language I couldn't translate feelings into. That evening, I found Mom in the living room, sorting through a box of Grandma's sheet music. "Can I keep these?" I asked, reaching for the stack. She hesitated, then shrugged. "Sure, I don't think the buyer wants old paper." She said it so casually, so carelessly, that it made something in me tighten. I sat down on the floor beside her, flipping through the pages. The sheets were yellowed, edges frayed, some with Grandma's looping handwriting across the margins, little notes like, "Play softly here," or "Pause. Breathe." Her writing still smelled faintly of her perfume. I held one page up and said, Do you remember this one? She played it every Sunday morning before church. Mom smiled faintly. I do. It used to drive your father crazy. Dad, who had just walked in, laughed. That's because she played it at full volume at 7 a.m. For a moment, we all smiled. Then the silence that followed was thick with something unspoken grief. Maybe, or guilt. Still, I said quietly. I think she'd want it to stay here. Mom sighed, putting the last of the sheet music into a folder. Sweetheart, it's just an object. It's not her. I didn't say anything. I just stared at the piano, feeling the familiar helplessness rise again. To them, sentiment was clutter. To me, it was memory that night. I overheard them talking again, this time from their room. She's too attached, Mom whispered. I thought she'd grown out of this. Dad's voice was softer, but tired. She understand eventually. We all have to let go. I pressed my back against the wall in the hallway, tears burning in my eyes. They didn't understand. They couldn't. The house felt different after that, colder, quieter. Even the air seemed heavy, like it was holding its breath. The piano sat untouched, waiting. I couldn't even bring myself to play it anymore. It felt like every note would be a goodbye, 3 days left. I reminded myself, 3 days until the sound of wooden wheels scraping the floor, until the silence would be final, but deep down, under the ache and frustration, a tiny spark began to stir. A thought, a memory, a possibility. Grandma once said, when words don't work, play. Maybe that was the only way left to make them listen. The house was unusually still the night before the sale. Even the air felt different, thick, expectant, as if the walls themselves were waiting for something to happen. The clock ticked in the hallway, steady and indifferent. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the faint glow under my door. Knowing my parents were asleep, tomorrow morning, strangers would walk into our home. They'd lift Grandma's piano, her heart, really, and roll it out the door. I'd hear the scrape of the legs on the floor, the thud of it being loaded onto a truck, and the sound of the engine driving away. That image had played in my mind all evening like a bad dream. I couldn't let that happen. Not without saying goodbye. Quietly, I crept out of bed and padded down the hallway. The floorboards creaked under my feet, each sound making me flinch. When I reached the living room, the piano stood there in the moonlight, half shrouded in shadow. Its polished surface reflected the silver glow from the window, and for a moment it looked almost alive, like it was waiting for me. I sat down on the bench and lifted the lid. The faint click of the hinge echoed softly. My fingers hovered above the keys, trembling slightly. I didn't have a plan. I didn't even know which song I would play. I only knew I couldn't let Grandma's voice fade without one last melody. And then I remembered her song. It didn't have a name. Grandma called it our Sunday tune. It was the first piece she ever taught me, a simple waltz that flowed gently, like a conversation between two hearts. I hadn't played it in years, not since the day she passed away. I pressed the first note. The sound filled the room, soft, hesitant at first, but clear. Then another note and another until the melody began to form. My fingers found the rhythm almost instinctively, as if Grandma's hands were guiding mine once again. The music rippled through the quiet house, weaving through the furniture, curling up the staircase. The warmth of the sound made something ache deep inside me. I could see her smile in my mind, her eyes crinkling, her head gently swaying to the beat. I could almost smell her lavender perfume. Halfway through, I heard a door open upstairs. Footsteps padded softly down the hall. For a moment, I thought about stopping, but I didn't. I couldn't. The song carried me forward. It wasn't just sound anymore. It was memory, apology, and love all tangled together. Each note said what I never could. Don't forget her. Don't let her go. By the time I reached the bridge, both my parents were standing in the doorway. They didn't say anything. My mother's hand rested lightly on the doorframe. Dad stood beside her, his expression unreadable. Still, I kept playing. The final notes rose and lingered, trembling softly in the air before fading into silence. The kind of silence that's alive, heavy with everything that's just been said without words. When I finally looked up, my mother's eyes were glistening. She brushed at her cheek quickly, as if embarrassed. Dad cleared his throat, looking away. That was her favorite. Mom whispered. I know, I said, my voice barely audible. No one spoke for a long time. The piano sat between us, the last echo of the melody still hanging faintly in the air. It felt as though the house itself was breathing again, remembering something it had forgotten. Finally, Dad let out a slow sigh. You sound just like her. Something in his tone, soft, cracked, made my chest tighten. We stayed there for a while, just the three of us and the silence Grandma had once filled with music. The piano wasn't just furniture anymore. It was her laughter, her lessons, her love. And for the first time in years, I saw my parents realize it too. Morning came far too soon. The first thing I heard was the soft rumble of a truck engine outside, followed by a car door slamming shut. For a moment, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, hoping last night had changed something, that maybe my parents had decided to call off the sale. But when I heard muffled voices downstairs, my stomach sank. I got up and hurried down the stairs. Mom was in the hallway, talking to a tall man in a gray jacket, the buyer. He looked kind enough, polite, but his hands were already measuring the piano with professional efficiency. He had the kind of calm demeanor people wear when they're doing their job. Not realizing they're dismantling someone else's memories, Dad stood beside him. Arms crossed, face unreadable. Morning, Mom said, forcing a smile. He's here a bit early, but that's fine. We'll help him get it loaded. Her voice was light, but her eyes avoided mine. I could tell she hadn't slept well either. The buyer knelt to inspect the piano legs, running his hand along the polished wood. Beautiful piece, he said. Early 1940s make, right? The craftsmanship's incredible. It'll look wonderful in my studio. His studio. The words hit me like a slap. I moved closer, instinctively putting a hand on the piano lid as though to shield it. It's been in our family for generations, I said quietly. He smiled politely. Then it's been well cared for. I promise I'll take good care of it too. I wanted to believe him, but no amount of care could replace what this piano meant here, in this home. Dad cleared his throat. We should get started, right? But before the man could respond, Mom spoke up. Wait, she said softly. Her voice was uncertain, almost fragile. The buyer paused, surprised. She turned to me, her expression troubled. Play it again? I blinked. What? Play Grandma's song, she said, her voice shaking slightly. Just once more. Before it goes. For a moment, I couldn't move. But then I saw the look on her face. Something had shifted overnight. There was a tenderness there I hadn't seen in years. I sat down on the bench. The air felt heavy, charged, as if the piano itself knew this might be its final song. My fingers trembled as they found their place on the keys. I began to play. The melody rose slowly, wrapping through the room, soft but certain. The notes danced off the walls, weaving through the morning light. My parents stood still, their eyes fixed on me, not with impatience or practicality, but with quiet reverence. Even the buyer stopped moving, his measuring tape hanging forgotten in his hand. By the time I reached the bridge, I saw tears glinting in Mom's eyes. Dad's jaw tightened, his usual calm cracking at the edges. He didn't look at anyone, just at the piano. When the final note faded, no one spoke. The silence stretched, full of memory. It wasn't the kind of silence that asks for words, it was the kind that understands. Mom turned toward Dad slowly. We can't sell it, she whispered. Dad's shoulders dropped. He exhaled a long, heavy sigh, then nodded once. No, he said quietly. We can't. The buyer hesitated. If you've changed your mind, I understand, he said gently. It's too special to part with. Mom smiled faintly through her tears. Thank you. I think we just remembered why it's still here. He nodded, gave me a small smile, and left without another word. The sound of the truck engine fading down the street felt like the first deep breath after a long silence. Dad reached out and ran his hand over the piano's lid. She'd be happy, he murmured. I smiled. She is. For the first time, the piano didn't look like an old object anymore. It looked alive again, glowing softly in the morning light. It wasn't just staying. It was home again. The rest of that morning felt like the world had exhaled. The tension that had haunted our house for weeks seemed to lift, replaced by something soft and unfamiliar peace. The piano sat quietly in its corner, but it didn't feel like furniture anymore. It felt present, like Grandma herself was sitting beside it, humming that old melody the way she used to when sunlight poured through the window. Mom made tea while Dad disappeared into the garage for a while. No one spoke much, but the silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that follows an understanding when words are no longer needed. When Dad came back in, he was carrying an old photo frame. Inside was a black and white picture of Grandma, sitting at that very piano, her hands mid-motion, her eyes half closed in joy. "Found this in one of the storage boxes," he said. "Figured it should stay where it belongs." He set it on the piano lid. The sight of it hit me like a wave. There she was, young and alive, playing the same instrument that had just brought us all back together. Mom brushed her fingers over the glass, her lips trembling. I'd forgotten how happy she looked when she played. I smiled faintly. "That's because the piano was her way of talking." Mom nodded. "And now it's yours." That afternoon we opened the windows wide. A gentle breeze drifted in, stirring the curtains, carrying with it the faint smell of jasmine from the garden. I sat down at the piano again, this time not out of desperation or sadness, but gratitude. When I began to play, my parents didn't stand at a distance, they came closer. Dad sat on the couch, quietly tapping his fingers to the rhythm, while Mom leaned against the doorway, her eyes soft. It wasn't Grandma's song this time. It was something new, something I improvised, a melody that belonged to us. The notes filled the house, warm and alive, echoing through rooms that had been silent for too long. At one point, I looked up and caught Mom wiping her eyes again. She laughed softly, embarrassed, and said, "Your grandma would have loved this." "I think she does," I said, smiling. From that day on, the piano became more than an old heirloom. It became the heart of our home again. Every Sunday, we'd gather around it. Sometimes I'd play, sometimes Mom would hum along, sometimes Dad would just listen quietly, pretending to read the newspaper. But we always ended with Grandma's song, the melody that had once changed everything. It became our ritual, our way of remembering her, not with grief, but with love. The seasons passed. New flowers bloomed outside, and life slowly found its rhythm again. The cracks that had quietly formed in our family, those small distances, created by years of routine and practicality, seemed to fade each time the piano played. One evening, months later, I came home to find Mom sitting at the piano alone. She was hesitating over the keys, trying to find the right notes. When she noticed me watching, she smiled shyly. "I'm a bit rusty," she said. "Want me to help?" I asked, sitting beside her. Together we began to play. Slowly at first, then more confidently, until the room filled with that familiar waltz once again. The same song that had once saved the piano and, in a way, saved us when the last note faded. Mom turned to me, eyes glistening. "I'm glad we didn't sell it," she whispered. I smiled, looking at Grandma's photo. It never would have let us. The piano gleamed softly in the golden evening light, its reflection flickering across the room. It wasn't just a piece of wood and strings anymore. It was a keeper of stories, of laughter, of love that refused to fade, and every time my fingers touched the keys, I could still feel Grandma there, her warmth, her patience, her voice whispering from somewhere between the notes. "See, love? Music never really leaves."